He sat alone in the dim light of a half-broken lamp, its yellow glow trembling against the cracked walls of a room that no longer belonged to him. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that comes only after everything has been taken, after every voice of admiration and applause is turned into an echo of absence. Satya Nadella, once a name uttered with reverence across continents, now found himself staring at the hollow shell of his own existence. His suit, once tailored with precision, now hung loose on a body eroded by sleepless nights and memories he could not silence. He thought of the empire he once commanded, the limitless resources he once wielded, the glass towers that bore his decisions as if they were divine decrees. And now nothing but this room, this silence, and the weight of everything that had gone wrong. It is almost unbearable, the irony of remembering how it all began. Because Satya did not come from wealth, not from the gilded halls of privilege, but from the dust and struggle of Hyderabad, India. He was born into a family that knew respect, but not abundance. His father, a civil servant hardened by the bureaucracy of a turbulent nation, and his mother, a teacher whose gentle voice carried the burden of expectation, raised him in a country teetering between tradition and a new modern ambition. From an early age, he learned to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. He was quiet, introspective, a boy who carried books like shields, and whose mind often wandered beyond the narrow streets he called home. There was a dream inside him, a hunger that no one around him could see, but one that burned relentlessly in his chest. Technology became his escape, the language that made sense when the world did not. As a young man, he moved to America, the land of impossible ambitions, armed with determination and the belief that he could carve his name into the granite of history. At first, he was just another immigrant student, another foreigner caught in the unforgiving machine of a country that measured worth in results. But he endured. He studied, he built, he coded, and slowly he became a man whose ideas carried weight. Microsoft was his chosen battlefield, a place that, in the early years, was both an empire of innovation and a kingdom plagued with its own arrogance. Satya rose quietly, without the flamboyance of others, without the arrogance of men who shouted their worth into every boardroom. He listened, he learned, and step by step he climbed. Each success was like a rung on a ladder that seemed to stretch into the clouds. Projects completed, teams guided, visions defended. He was not loud, but he was relentless. And then came the crown, a moment when the throne of Microsoft, that colossal machine of power and influence, was placed on his shoulders. In 2014, he became CEO, a position that transformed him from a respected executive into a man whose name was carved into the history of global business. At first, the world was skeptical. Who was Satya Nadella? A quiet engineer, an outsider to the traditional image of a corporate titan. But the doubts melted away as his vision began to unfold. Under his leadership, Microsoft shifted like a giant waking from slumber. The company that had been fading in relevance found new life in the cloud, in innovation, in the subtle art of adapting to a world changing faster than anyone could predict. Share prices soared. Billions of dollars flowed like rivers through the channels of his decisions. And suddenly Satya was not just a CEO, he was a savior. Journalists praised him, employees adored him, investors worshipped him. He was the architect of rebirth, the man who carried one of the most powerful corporations in the world back into the light of dominance. But success is a dangerous flame. It warms, it illuminates, but it also blinds. And as Satya rose, so too did the shadows that trailed him. There were whispers, faint at first, of deals struck in silence, of compromises hidden behind polished press releases. In the euphoria of victory, he overlooked the fine cracks beginning to form in the empire he had rebuilt. Power demands sacrifice, and Satya, like those before him, gave pieces of himself away in the pursuit of more. The long hours turned into endless days. His family became specters in the background of his schedule. His health began to bend under the weight of ceaseless ambition. But worse than all of that was pride. That quiet, insidious pride that convinced him he was untouchable. And with untouchability comes blindness. There was the acquisition massive, historic, lauded by headlines as a masterstroke. But behind the curtains, it was built on fragile ground, numbers manipulated to shine brighter than they truly were. At first, the deception seemed harmless. Everyone in the industry polished numbers, exaggerated outcomes, played the game of illusions. But what begins as illusion eventually demands reality as payment. The first cracks appeared in the form of lawsuits, small at first, from investors who claimed promises had not been kept. Then came the media storms, relentless in their hunger for blood. Documents leaked. Emails surfaced. Stories spread of toxic leadership decisions, of cultures within the company that thrived on fear rather than innovation. Satya's name, once spoken with admiration, now became entangled with accusation. Was he a visionary, or was he a manipulator cloaked in charisma? The fall was slow at first, like a giant tree swaying before it collapses. Stock prices dipped, partners pulled back, governments demanded answers. And Satya, once the calm captain of the ship, began to drown in the very ocean he had commanded. His nights grew longer. He sat awake, staring at spreadsheets, contracts, press statements, his mind spiraling in a fog of regret and denial. He told himself it was temporary, that he could fix it, that he was still the man who had resurrected an empire. But deep down, he knew the tide had turned. Allies vanished. Those who once praised him distanced themselves, whispering his name only in closed-door meetings, plotting their escape from the ruin. And then came betrayal, not from enemies, but from those he trusted most. A senior executive, once his closest confidant, turned witness against him in exchange for immunity. Another, who had toasted with him in celebration of billion-dollar deals, now testified that Satya had knowingly misled investors. Each revelation was a knife. Each testimony, a reminder that loyalty is only as strong as the foundation of power it feeds upon. The empire collapsed. The acquisitions unraveled. The lawsuits multiplied. His resignation, once unthinkable, became inevitable. And when it came, it was not with applause, but with silence. A short statement released to the press. A man who had once stood on stages before thousands, now reduced to a footnote in articles about corporate scandals. And now, in this dimly lit room, Satya sits. No cameras, no applause, no empire, just the memory of what once was, and the unbearable knowledge of how it all slipped through his fingers. He thinks of Hyderabad, of the boy who dreamed of more, of the man who once believed he could bend the world to his will. He thinks of the choices he made, the compromises, the pride, the blindness. And he wonders, not for the first time, if the rise was worth the fall. Because in the end, every empire is fragile, and every man, no matter how powerful, is just one decision away from ruin. The room felt smaller with each passing night. Satya would pace from one cracked wall to another, his steps echoing in the emptiness, as though the silence itself was mocking him. He had once commanded skyscrapers filled with thousands of employees, entire buildings that pulsed with his vision. Now his kingdom was reduced to a rented apartment with peeling paint and a single wooden chair. He often thought about how quickly respect turns to disdain, how the sane voices that once begged for his attention now crossed the street to avoid being associated with him. He replayed the fall in his mind, again and again, unable to escape the nightmare that had become reality. The headlines had not been kind. Tech Messiah or corporate fraud, the Dallas empire of illusion. Each article was like a stone thrown against a fragile window, shattering whatever fragments of reputation remained. He told himself, at first, that time would heal it, that the truth would eventually surface. But time did not heal it, only deepened the wound. What cut deepest was not the financial ruin, though the numbers were staggering. Billions lost in the collapse of acquisitions that had once been hailed as revolutionary. What truly cut him was the humiliation. The eyes of the world had once looked at him with admiration. Now they burned with judgment. In airports, he noticed the stares. In restaurants, whispers followed him like shadows. It wasn't the loss of wealth that stripped him bare. It was the loss of dignity. And yet, beneath the shame, there was still the ghost of ambition. The same fire that had driven a boy from Hyderabad to the heights of global power still flickered inside him. But the fire now was no longer pure. It was twisted, poisoned by regret and memory. He asked himself endlessly, where did I go wrong? Was it the pride? Was it the greed? Or was it the simple belief that I was different, that I could dance with power without being burned? His family bore the cost as much as he did. His wife, once the quiet strength behind his meteoric rise, could no longer stand the weight of public shame. The strain became unbearable, and she left, retreating into a life of anonymity that Satya could no longer offer her. His children, who had once proudly told their classmates that their father was a leader, a builder of futures, now spoke his name with hesitation, if at all. Isolation became his only companion. There were nights when he drank. Not heavily, not like those who lose themselves completely, but enough to blur the sharp edges of memory. He would sit by the window, glass in hand, staring at the city lights that once seemed like his to command. Each light was a reminder of someone else's ambition, someone else's success, someone else's empire rising while his had already turned to ash. But perhaps the most haunting of all were the memories of the boardrooms. He could still hear the sound of applause, still feel the weight of microphones, still see the glow of screens projecting his vision to millions. In those moments of memory, he would almost believe he was still there, that the fall had not happened, that it was all just a cruel dream. But the room around him was too real, the silence too heavy, the loss too sharp. And then came the reckoning. The lawsuits did not end with his resignation. Investigations dragged on for years. He was summoned to courts, forced to sit beneath the cold eyes of judges and lawyers who dissected every decision he had ever made. Each hearing was another humiliation, another public stripping of his legacy. He fought back at first, clinging to the belief that he could clear his name. But truth is complex, and in the end, perception becomes its own reality. To the world, Satya Nadella was no longer the man who resurrected Microsoft. He was the man who let it fall again. And so, he withdrew further. He stopped appearing in public, stopped answering calls. Even his closest friends, those who had once sworn loyalty, found their messages unanswered. The loneliness was crushing, but it was also the only way he knew to survive. Yet even in the abyss, there were moments of clarity, moments when he remembered why he had chased ambition in the first place. He thought of his parents in Hyderabad, of his mother's voice encouraging him to dream beyond the limits of circumstance. He thought of the boy who stayed up at night with books and machines, believing that technology could change the world. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been buried under pride and pressure, under numbers and shareholders, under illusions of invincibility. Satya began to walk the city at night. Not the shining financial districts where towers cut into the sky, but the quiet streets where life was lived in smaller, harsher realities. He saw faces hardened by struggle, people who carried burdens far heavier than his own. And in those faces, he found a reflection of himself, not the CEO, not the fallen titan, but the man who had once simply wanted to build something meaningful. But redemption is not easy. It is not public speeches or magazine covers. It is the slow, painful work of living with the consequences of your choices. Satya found small ways to rebuild not wealth, not power, but fragments of dignity. He taught at community centers, speaking to young people who dreamed of technology as he once had. He shared not the glossy version of his story, but the brutal truth that success is fragile, that ambition can devour you, that pride is the slow poison of every empire. Some listened with awe, others with pity, but Satya did not care. For the first time in years, his words were not a performance, they were real. There were nights when he would return from those talks and sit once more in his empty apartment. But the silence no longer mocked him. It became a companion, a mirror in which he saw not just the ruins of his past, but the possibility of something else. He would never be the man he once was. He would never return to the glass towers or the roaring applause. That chapter was closed, written in both triumph and tragedy. But perhaps there was meaning in the fall itself. Perhaps his story was not one of empire and ruin, but of humanity of a man who learned too late that greatness is not measured by wealth or power, but by the scars we carry and the truths we leave behind. Satya Nadella, once a titan of industry, now lived as a man among men. Forgotten by history, yes. Mocked by headlines, yes. But within his solitude, he carried something deeper than legacy. He carried the weight of truth. And truth, though it does not erase the past, has a way of piercing through even the darkest night. In the end, he would die in obscurity, far from the headlines that once crowned him. A quiet passing in a quiet room. But those who had heard him in his final years, those who had listened to his reflections in community halls and small gatherings, would remember not the CEO, not the scandal, but the man who had lived the rise and the fall, and who dared to speak of it without disguise. His story is not one of happy endings. It is not a tale of triumphant return. It is a warning, a reflection, a mirror held to anyone who dreams of reaching the top. For the higher you climb, the further you fall. And sometimes, the fall is the only way to truly see what you were chasing all along. Satya's life was a testament to ambition, to power, to ruin, and to consequence. And in his silence, in his solitude, in his final reflections, there lies a truth that lingers like smoke in the air. Greatness is never free. It always demands a price. And sometimes, that price is everything.